Hello and welcome to Dogs or Torches. In this episode, we are joined with Dominic LaMantia to discuss a late medieval and early modern debate centered around the question of analogy and the controversies that developed after the time of Cajetan, specifically what we're going to call the Cajetan Problem. As is well known, many debates and controversies ranged between scholastic theologians on the topic of analogy and syllogistic demonstration. And one particular influential and popular solution to these controversies came from Thomas de Vio Cajetan in the 15th century, who provided his own theory of analogy of proportionality loosely based on the thought of Aquinas. And while Cajetan's treatise on analogy enjoyed widespread popularity in the late Middle Ages onward, his solution was, as we're going to see, implicitly taken up by Jesuit scholastic figures as a thematic concern. And it was used in many ways to discredit realist accounts of objective precision, as well as justifying nominalist ontologies. And so for this interview, we are joined with Dominic LaMantia to discuss the Cajetan problem in late scholastic debates on analogy. Dominic is a doctoral student in philosophy at Notre Dame. In 2017, he graduated from Georgetown University, where he double majored in philosophy and math. He is interested in medieval philosophy, metaphysics, and philosophy of religion. Dominic, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast. How are you doing today?
Doing well. Thanks for having me on. It's great to be here.
Yeah, you recently gave a presentation on this topic for the Angelicum conference on univocity and analogy and the Thomas and Scotus traditions. And there was a lot of really interesting topics and presentations explored there. And we actually had on a while ago Father Philip Neri-Rees to discuss Matthias Aquarius's thoughts on univocity, yes, but also his really interesting and somewhat puzzling idea of the scope of metaphysical inquiry. So I figured before we begin, I figured I could just ask, what got you interested in researching these debates and controversies? What sort of sparked your interest?
Well, someone who works on medieval philosophy, it's hard to avoid the problem of analogy and univocity. It's one of the very interesting and controverted issue in the period, right? And there's ramifications in all different areas. Um, the impetus for this particular project was actually this conference, because I know Father Philip Neri-Rees, and he was hosting this conference, and it looked cool. And I was trying to think, well, what would be a good way to contribute to this conference? And read around and came up with found this stuff in some of these Jesuit nominalists, and thought that would be a good contribution.
I figured maybe before we dive right into the Jesuit nominalist and Cajetanian controversies, maybe we can give some background clarity to some of the distinctions and concerns that develop in the course of scholasticism. One of these interesting distinctions that develops is to speak of what are called formal and objective ratio rationis, or concepts. What exactly is this distinction?
Yeah, good. So this is an important distinction that's sort of implicitly in Scotus. It's becomes explicit in Oriel, and then is taken up by pretty much everyone after that. And formal concept is it's a concept that's in the mind. So it's an accident by which we think of something. And the objective concept is the thing thought of. So, for example, you have a concept in your mind, that's the formal concept by which you think of human nature. And human nature is the objective concept. That's the thing that's thought of, and you think of it by the formal concept, which is some accident property in the mind.
Right, right. I've always thought it was kind of weird how objective concept is referred to as a concept, because it really doesn't seem like it actually is uh, a concept. It's just the entity rendered as objectively present to a cognitive power. It almost makes me, I almost was going to ask if there's kind of an equivocation going on between formal and objective concept to refer to both as concept. But another debate, or not debate, but another distinction that's kind of made is between objective and formal precision. I mean, what's the crux of this debate, and how does it relate to questions of nominalism and realism?
Yeah, so we're still unpacking the history of this. Jakob Schmutz has done some very good work on it. This distinction, I think, was sort of implicitly there since Aquinas and before, but really becomes explicit in the 17th century. In some of the Jesuit scholastics realized that this is what's going on, and then it becomes a huge debate between the schools. And the question is this. So we'll stick to one example because it comes up in all sorts of areas, but only one of the areas will be relevant for us. So Socrates has animality and rationality, right? Socrates is a rational animal. That's what it is to be human. And almost everyone agrees, apart from some of realists, that Socrates' animality is just his rationality. They're identical. Why? Because Socrates is an animal by his human nature, and he's rational by his human nature. It's not like he has multiple forms that are sort of layer cake over him, one making him animal, the other one making him rational. No, instead he just has one nature, human nature, one essence, right? And that essence is that by which he is both animal and rational. So his animality just is his rationality. Okay. Nevertheless, clearly everyone agrees we at least have different formal concepts of his animality and rationality. So again, the different accidents in the mind. So one formal concept can bring to mind Socrates' animality, and a different one can bring to mind his rationality. The debate then is this. What are the objective concepts corresponding to those distinct formal concepts? The people who defend objective precision, and that's the Thomists and the Scotists, think that corresponding to the distinct formal concepts of animality and rationality, there are distinct objective concepts of animality and rationality. So when we think of Socrates' rationality, we can prescind, that comes from the Latin root means to like cut off. So we can think of his rationality and not his animality. We can cut off animality, as it were, even though they're identical in Socrates. So the distinct formal concepts are going to have distinct objective concepts corresponding to them. For defenders of formal precision, they think that's not possible. They think instead the distinct formal concepts of Socrates' animality and rationality have one and the same objective concept corresponding to them, namely Socrates' nature.
Okay.
So we don't have this distinct grasp of Socrates' animality apart from his rationality, or his rationality apart from his animality. We can't cut off these distinct concepts in that way. Instead, what we do is we grasp Socrates' essence as a whole. And they're going to come up with theories and explanations for why it seems like we think of Socrates' animality and not his rationality, for example. So they'll say one's explicit in the concept, the other's implicit, but or things like that. But they're both present, unlike the defenders of objective precision, who think when you objectively prescind, there's only the one objective concept there, nothing else, not even implicitly.
Okay. And if you can just, obviously there's going to be case exceptions to this, but would it be fair to say that the majority of those arguing for a realist ontology argue for objective precision, and those for a nominalist, it tends to be formal, or what would you say to that?
That's right. That's right. So the defenders of objective precision are, they have some sort of realist ontology because they think there is, in fact, this animality that's common some way to Socrates and Plato and a horse. the defenders of formal precision, the nominalists, don't think that, because when you think of Socrates as animality, you're just thinking of Socrates, right? You're thinking of Socrates as nature.
Mm.
And Socrates' nature isn't common to Plato and a horse, because they're not Socrates, right?
Right.
So, yeah, so all the nominalists go in for defending formal precision, and all the realists, the Thomas and the Scotus and Suarez and some other Jesuits go in for the objective precision.
Gotcha. And then, of course, the question then becomes, how does this apply to questions and debates regarding analogy and univocity and things of that sort with respect to our concepts of being. If I can maybe then ask, is by the later periods of 15th and 16th century scholasticism, is there any common understanding between Thomist and Scotist factions about what the debate hinges on or consists in? Because as I understand it, in the 14th century, the controversy wasn't exactly between Aquinas and his position and Scotus and his position. It was rather Scotus reacting to Henry of Ghent and the Henrician sort of solution to this problem. I know that early on, Hervaeus, Natalis, and Sutton sort of try to make the connection between the two, but by the later centuries, it seems like there's a more of an agreement among the schoolmen about what the disagreement consists in for analogy and univocity. What is this debate?
Yeah, so in later scholasticism, especially once we get into the 17th century, well, as you were saying, all along, the concepts, all along, the terms analogy, univocity, and equivocity are all being used equivocally, basically. And that continues throughout the entirety of this debate, which makes it difficult to track in many respects.
Mm.
But there are some camps that come to agree, and so there's a group of Thomists and a group of Scotists who basically agree with each other on what the terms of the debate are, and how it should be, how the debate should be carried out.
Mm.
These Thomists include people like Cajetan, John of St. Thomas. Those are probably the most well-known, the names. And on the Scotus side, the most well-known figure who's in this camp is Bartolomeo Mastri, who is known as the Prince of the Scotists. And he's a very good philosopher. So their agreement consists in this. Univocal terms are terms where the name is common, right? So the term itself is the same.
Mm.
And there's one objective concept corresponding to it.
Okay.
So their example, being realists, is going to be an example would be animal. That there's a term, there's one name. It's the same name when you apply it to Socrates and to Phaedo. And according to these Thomas and Scotus, there's going to be one objective concept corresponding to it, namely animal nature, right? And that animal nature is present in Socrates, it's present in Phaedo, and so that term is going to be univocal. On the other hand, equivocal terms are going to be where there's one name and multiple objective concepts corresponding to it. So bank here is a classic example in English. The bank can refer to the financial institution or the side of a river, and there's multiple objective concepts corresponding to that, right? There's not one objective concept.
Right.
So that's going to be an equivocal term. You can't use that in a syllogism, right? That's going to be invalid if you try to argue using bank as a middle term.
Right.
And then analogy, there's even some agreement about this. Problem is there's a bunch of different types of analogy, right? But the one that we're concerned with, the one that's really important for Cajetan's theory, is analogy of proper proportionality. And in Cajetan's theory. That's gonna occur where there's some name that's common, and there are two objective. There's not one objective concept. There's multiple objective concepts corresponding to it, but they're signified only insofar as they are similar.
Right.
So, um, an example of this might be uh, to be grasped, something like that. So, a an idea or a concept can be grasped, right, when you understand it, and an object, physical object, can be grasped, and that might be something like uh, uh, when you grasp something, they might be in some way available for use, or
Right.
something like that, and that's going to be common to both the idea and the physical object. So when you signify them insofar as they're similar, they're going to be there's multiple objective concepts, right? But there's this similarity between them that the mind is grasping onto.
Right, right. So in with Cajetan's theory of analogy, of course, we've had Dottore and Hochschild on to discuss this theory of analogy. I'll be sure to link them in the description below. But with Cajetan's theory, it doesn't quite sound like he's defending objective precision with respect to our formal and objective concepts, but also kind of seems like he is because of the similitude. It doesn't seem like what would he have to say to that?
Yeah, so those terms hadn't come into vogue yet, so you won't find him,
Right,
as far as
right.
I know, talking about objective and formal precision. But what Cajetan would say, I think, and what a bunch of later Thomists say, including John of St. Thomas, is that there's objective precision between what are called the metaphysical grades. So if you go up and down the Porphyrian tree, um, Socrates, also all genus and differences, genera and differences. So animality, rationality, body, living, substance, all of those you can objectively prescind. However, when it comes to being, there's no objective precision there.
Okay.
Um, and that's and so this group of Thomas and Scotus that I mentioned, um, Mastery, Cajetan, John of St. Thomas, more or less agree, I think, that the debate between the Thomist and Scotus side consists in this. Um, can we objectively prescind being from its inferiors? Can we is there one objective concept of being that's common to all beings, to God and creatures, to substance and accident,
Right.
all that stuff? And the Thomists want to say no. Instead, they want to say there's an analogy of proper proportionality, this group of Thomists at least. And the Scotists, such as Mastery, want to say yes, there's one objective concept of being. When we say God's a being, when we say an accident, redness is a being, we say Socrates is a being. The being presented to the mind is the same, the nature of what it is to be. They're going to say that's to be beyond nothing or something like that. That's the
Right.
least common denominator that all things have. And the Thomists want to deny that there is this one least common denominator.
Right. Right. Okay. It sounds like if I'm hearing you correctly, Cajetan and those who follow after him are perfectly happy to grant objective precision when it comes to our genera and species concepts, but when it comes to our concept of being and its analogates, they're not going to hold to that. Instead, they're going to hold to analogy of this proper proportionality.
That's exactly right.
Okay. Well, if I may ask, as we've said, Cajetan's theory of analogy, it is enormously popular in the coming centuries, and even reaching to sort of like 20th century neo-scholastic revivals of medieval philosophy. Cajetan is still extremely popular with respect to his theory of analogy. But in your studies of analogy in the schoolmen, are there any Thomist sort of figures who whoever contests or call into question Cajetan's schema or theory of analogy. I know that De Torre in his book talks about immediately after Cajetan, figures like Francesco Silvestri, Chrysostom Javelli, they both kind of pick apart Cajetan's theory, even though that it's still extremely popular. It's not as uniform as one would think that, as soon as Cajetan's De Nominalologia drops, everyone's taking it up.
Yeah, it's a good question, and sadly, we don't have these are really uncharted waters.
Okay.
This post-Cajetanian uh, Thomism on this question. I mean, Dominic de Torre's book is excellent, but it only goes up to, as you say, up to Javelli, more or less. And
Mm.
there's a whole hundreds of years after that, and it's hard to say who adopts what. Um, but Javelli, you mentioned, is one of these figures who does not side with Cajetan's theory of analogy, and nor does he agree with the way of carving up the debate that I just laid out.
Okay,
Um,
interesting.
because he thinks, as I understand him, there is one objective concept of being, but yet doesn't think that by that reason he's committed to univocity. Um,
Oh,
but Mastery and Cajetan and others they think that's all you need. Once you have that, you have univocity more or less. And Javelli doesn't think that. So similarly, for Ferrariensis, Ferrariensis has a different theory than Cajetan, but he has the same solution to what de Torre calls the equivocation problem.
okay.
And so that means, in a way, he's going to be subject to some of these criticisms that the Jesuit nominalists are going to raise.
Right.
But in terms of later than that, I mean, John of St. Thomas seems to more or less hold to Cajetan's theory. And Giovanni Siri, who's this 18th century Thomist, he doesn't seem to quite hold Cajetan's theory, but he does, I think, agree with the way of carving up the terrain, and does agree with Cajetan's solution to the equivocation problem. That analogy of proper proportionality is going to save the day.
Okay.
Apart from that, I don't really know how popular it is, and I don't know if anyone knows.
Okay. Yeah, that's fair. Maybe that's a subject for a future monograph in the works.
Mhm.
All right then. Well, maybe I figured we could shift courses to discussing the Jesuit scholastics and their arguments for what we would call today nominalism. But before we discuss uh, all that, maybe we could maybe outline how exactly the Jesuit thinkers understand univocity, equivocity, and analogy. Because while eventually by this time you get agreement with figures like Maestrius and Cajetan about what the debate consists in, it, if I understand the debate correctly, it almost seems like the Jesuits part ways to how we understand univocity and analogy and equivocation.
Yeah, I'm wondering if it might be helpful to do a brief overview of Cajetan's theory of analogy
Sure,
at this point,
sure.
before sort of moving on to that. So, um, on Cajetan, right? So there's this question going back to Scotus, this a challenge that Scotus raises to Henry of Ghent and defenders of analogy, where Scotus says, look, if you're using if being isn't univocal, if we don't have a univocal concept of being, then all arguments we make using being as a middle term across the categories and between God and creatures are going to commit fallacy of equivocation. And he thinks you need the one ratio, one objective concept to do the trick, to make your syllogisms valid. And Cajetan's basic response to this is he wants to keep this Thomist line that he wants, that that there against Chiavelli that there is no one objective concept of being. So you have at least 10 across the categories, right? For the 10 categories, and then there's also one of God, right? And there's nothing common between them. So these kinds of being are just they're brutally similar to each other. There's nothing in common that they share, unlike Phaedo and Socrates. They have animality in common, right?
Right.
Substance being and accident being have nothing in common, contra the Scotus. But they are similar to each other in certain respects, not totally, but they are similar. And because of the similarity that they have, we can form a concept which grasps them insofar as they are similar.
Okay.
And this concept that grasps them insofar as they are similar, it's going to be an analogous concept based on the way we've defined things, because there's not going to be one objective concept corresponding to it. There's just going to be the multiple kinds of being out there in the world. Mm-hmm. However, Cajetan thinks this can be used validly in syllogism because it's only going to capture the entities insofar as they're similar. So an example of this might be, as I said, using grasped earlier. I might say, what is grasped is available for use. I grasped the concept of analogy. Therefore, concept of analogy is available for use. That you might think that seems like a good syllogism, no equivocation there, and yet there's no one objective concept that's common to the two senses of being grasped. So this is Cajetan's basic response about how we can have no single objective concept of being, and yet have validly reason and syllogize about being.
Right.
And that's the relevant aspect of Cajetan's theory about analogy for our purposes. Then you ask about the Jesuit nominalists. Okay, so a little bit about these guys. These are not the first Jesuits who do this, just as a historical point. So you get Fonseca and Molina and Suarez. These are perhaps the most famous of the Jesuit scholastics, and they're all realists. They believe in objective precision. They have their own different views about analogy and univocity too, right? And they're also interesting to discuss on this matter. But in the generation after Suarez, there is this another Jesuit who's named Pedro Hurtado de Mendoza, and he sort of revives nominalism and makes this. He writes a course in philosophy, which was the main genre, or began to be the main genre just about his time, where you'd write it's like at least 1,000-page treatise that covers every topic in philosophy. It was a course designed for students to take. And he wrote one, and his views in general are sort of this weird synthesis of nominalism, Scotism, and Thomism. And they sort of purge away some of the like when we hear nominalism today, we often have bad connotations associated with this. And I think these Jesuit nominalists sort of get rid of some of the more nasty aspects of like Occam's view, and but keep a good amount of it, and supplement it with stuff from Scotus and supplement it with stuff from Aquinas, and you get this interesting mix. And his student, Hurtado's student, was another Jesuit named Rodrigo Arriaga. And Arriaga was a very important philosopher in his time. So much so his lectures were so popular. He taught in Prague that apparently there came to be a saying, "Videre Pragum ardire Arriagum," see Prague, hear Arriaga,
Oh,
and
cool.
people would travel, go and hear his lectures. He's a very interesting figure. Then within the Jesuit order, there came to be this massive fight between the realists and the nominalists. So the Jesuit order was itself very divided on this question. In any event, the figures that we're looking at are on this nominalist side.
Okay.
And they agree with Occam and the early nominalists that there are no common natures. And what they end up doing is more or less, I'm not sure they're doing this explicitly. Certainly, I've never seen them cite Cajetan or anything like that. But what they end up doing is more or less taking Cajetan's theory of how we form a concept being and use it everywhere.
Right.
So there's Socrates, there's Plato, and there's Phaedo. They share nothing in common, right? There's no common nature, just like the various kinds of being do for Cajetan. Nevertheless, brutally, they're going to be similar to each other in certain respects and not in others. And Socrates will be more similar to Plato than he is to Phaedo. Just like, according to Cajetan will also make a move like that. Accidents are more similar to substance than they are to God.
Right.
Right. And that's just a brute fact. And then the Jesuit nominalists are going to say, even though there's nothing in common between Socrates and Plato and Phaedo, nevertheless, we can form a concept of them insofar as they are similar. And when we form a concept of them insofar as they're similar, when we form a concept of the three of them insofar as they're similar, we're going to get the concept of animal, the formal concept of animal, right?
Right.
And when we form a formal concept of Socrates and Plato insofar as they're similar, we're going to get a concept of humanity. And even though there's nothing that they have in common. And that's basically exactly what Cajetan does with being. So they're just taking his same program and now they're using it for nominalist ends. They're thinking, look, Cajetan, if you're right about that, we can form these sorts of concepts about being, and it can do all the things that we need it to do. It can function in syllogisms. It can explain our phenomenology. It can do all this stuff. Why? Let's just say that that's what happens everywhere.
Right.
So Socrates and Plato don't have any humanity in common. They're just like more similar to each other than they are to other things. And so we form a concept of them.
Okay, so if I understand you correctly, it sounds like what these Jesuit nominalist figures are doing are they're saying that Cajetan's solution is brilliant, but it's rather ad hoc to only apply it to our concept of being and not these genera and species that we form. And
That's right.
that his solution, it allows for valid syllogistic demonstrations just as fine, so we can apply that equally to all the sorts of concepts that we make of beings in the world.
Right. Why not just say that everything is analogous? I
Okay.
think there's almost no univocal properties. Almost none of our predication is univocal. Why not say that?
Interesting.
No, they don't say that in those words because they want to maintain at least the way of speaking that Aristotle has, where we talk about animal being univocal to Socrates and Phaedo. But that they can do that because they redefine what it is to be univocal, what it is to be analogous, and what it is to be equivocal. For them, to be for some concept to be predicated univocally is for you to have one term, multiple objective concepts, but they're signified only insofar as they're similar, right? And that's just how like John of St. Thomas and Mastery and others define what it is to be analogous with an analogy of proper proportionality. So they just take that definition and say, no, that's what it is to be univocal. And so now Arriaga says he holds to the univocity of the concept of being. He says he holds to the univocity of animal. But then when you look at what he means by that, if you understand it through this Maastrichtian, Cajetanian, John of St. Thomas lens, you see that what they're saying is actually basically everything, basically all of our concepts are analogous.
Okay, so gentle listeners, if you're wondering what the Cajetan problem is, this is it. It seems to be that how can we simultaneously hold to objective precision with our genera and species concepts? How can we be realist with respect to universals, but also simultaneously hold to Cajetan's position that there are a multiplicity of objective rationes without, with respect to our concept of being without committing special pleading. Uh, I think you kind of put the pin on like what's the problem, Dominic, with Cajetan's theory. And if I may ask, then are there any in the coming century, are there any Scotists or even Thomists that are aware of this problem or try to give solutions with respect to it?
Yeah. So in a way, Scotus himself seems to anticipate this problem a little bit. It's one of his arguments against Henry of Ghent's theory, who has it's not definitely not the same as Cajetan or Aquinas's or anything like that, but there are some. It is a theory trying to defend analogy, and Scotus says to him, "Look, Henry, um, if your theory is right, we'd have no way of showing that any of our concepts are univocal. And if uh, you were to tell someone, no, this concept is univocal, they would say, why should I think that? And you'd have nothing to tell them. And
Okay.
that's what Scotus says to Henry. And this line is sort of repeated by Mastery at one point, but no one dwells on it very long. They're just kind of some throwaway lines that they have, and that was sort of the line that inspired this research project, the line in Scotus. But I think that is the problem: is what can the Thomists? Well, there are two sort of worries here. Is one is are these Cajetanian Thomists being inconsistent, right? Are they treating things that are the same uh, differently, and having is there some implicit contradiction or inconsistency in how they treat being differently than they treat genera and species concepts? That's one worry. Second worry is say they're not being inconsistent. The next worry is can they can they argue for their position against the Jesuit nominalists in a convincing manner? Is there anything that they can say to sort of defend their position?
Right.
And one of the things that I argue in my paper that I have is that uh, they have a solution to the first problem, and they do not have a solution to the second problem.
Okay.
Um, so um, I think at the end of the day, and we can go into some examples here, um, there it's going to be difficult for them to argue for their position against the nominalists for reasons that will become clear.
Well, yeah, maybe we can go into some of those early attempts to answer those two, or at least one of those conundrums. In your talk, you talk about this. One of these responses is the cognizable argument.
Yeah. So what I call the cognizability argument um, is comes up in a bunch of Thomists who are trying to respond to this. It's interesting about the history of who's reading whom in the 17th and 18th century. The Scotists pretty well read. They're reading each other. They're reading the Thomists. They're reading the Jesuits. The the Jesuits are reading Cajetan and Scotus, and but they're not reading too many sort of post Cajetanian people who aren't fellow Jesuits,
Okay.
with the exception of in the Molinist controversy, but that would make sense.
Interesting.
The
Okay.
Dominicans, the Dominicans, and the Thomists broadly are they're definitely they're reading their own order, they're reading their own tradition, and they're reading Scotus, and some of them know Scotus very well, but and they know Suarez and Vasquez, but apart from that, they don't really follow their contemporaries and other orders, as far as I can tell.
Interesting.
So much so that, Arriaga's writing in the 1620s, and I wasn't able to find a Thomist who's responding to him on this point. It's like huge point, right?
Right.
Wasn't able to find anyone responding to him until the 18th century. Um, so it's like over 80 years later that they're finally getting around to realizing that there's this Jesuit nominalism that they need to respond to.
Right.
Um, in any event, once you get to the 18th century, there's a bunch of people who are responding, and so this cognizability argument is made by a bunch of Thomists that that I had never heard of prior to finding them. So Villalba, Polanco, Vischel, Gabriel Conception, Giovanni Siri. Um, the biggest deal of these guys, I think, is Giovanni Siri, and he's worth reading. He's good. Anyways, the cognizability argument is an argument against Arriaga and the Jesuit nominalists that saying, look, we do objectively prescind um, our concepts of animal and rational, so genera and differences and species. Um, we do objectively prescind them. There is one objective concept of animality and of humanity,
Mm.
and that's why you're wrong and realism is vindicated. All right. So this is one of their arguments for that. And it goes like this. First premise, if X is identical to Y, and X can be cognized without Y being cognized, then there is objective precision between X and Y. Everyone agrees with that. That's just what it is to be objectively prescinded, more or less. Two things are identical, you cognize one without the other.
Mm.
Okay. Premise two, but in man, animality and rationality are identical, and animality can be cognized without rationality. Therefore, there's objective precision between animality and rationality. Okay. The second premise that, namely, even though animality and rationality are identical, and you can cognize one without the other, they defend by they commonly defend by an example like this. You can see a human from a long way off and not know that they're human. You can see that they're moving, so you know they're an animal, but you can't tell that they're human. And they're like, look, this is an example where you can be certain that they're an animal, but you can doubt whether they're rational.
Right.
And so this is a case where you're cognizing animality, but you're not cognizing rationality. And if that's right, boom, we got objective precision. Here's the problem. That argument is almost exactly like an argument Scotists frequently use against the Thomists to establish the univocity of the concept of being.
Right.
It even
certain and
sounds like a
doubtful.
certain and doubtful argument,
Right.
right? So the Thomists the Scotists make this argument frequently, and they say, look, if X is identical to Y and X can be cognized without Y being cognized, then there's objective precision between X and Y. Okay, the same first premise. We all agree on that. All parties agree on that. Here's the second premise. But in a given substance, being and substance are identical, and being can be cognized without substance being cognized. Okay, we can cognize that something is without knowing whether it's a substance or not, right? You can know that a common example is like light. You know that light is a being, but is light a substance, an accident?
Right.
I don't know. We can debate about that, right? And they go, look, there you go. Cognize being without cognizing substance or accident. Therefore, there's objective precision between being and substance. It's basically the same argument structurally as the cognizability argument that the Thomists make against the nominalists. Now, here's one of the tricky parts: is both the nominalists and the Thomists agree that Scotist version fails. Right? They both agree. They say, look, in a given substance, being and substance are identical, sure, but you can't cognize being without substance being cognized. Even though maybe it seems like you can, what you're doing is you're forming this instead. What you're forming is a concept of that has a proper proportional similarity between being and substance, right? So the Thomists think that this move is a good move, in general, right? They need it in order to save their position against the Scotists. But then the question is, why can't the nominalists just do the same move? The Thomists already admit that this is a good move and it works in the case of being. The nominalists are just saying, yeah, we're doing the same thing to respond to your argument now against us. Uh, you uh, you can't cognize animality without rationality. When you see someone from a long way off, you are cognizing both animality and rationality. It's just that the animality is the only one, only animality is present to your mind, and you're forming this concept that has this proportional similarity, just like the Thomists say with on the being case.
Right.
And basically, my conclusion from looking at a bunch of these Thomist responses to the rise of Jesuit nominalism is basically all of their arguments have the same structure. For every argument they give for objective precision of genus and difference, the Scotists either in fact did or could offer an extremely similar argument for the objective precision of being from its
Right.
inferiors. That there is this one common objective concept of being common to substance and accident, God and creatures. Both the nominalists and Thomists agree that those Scotist arguments fail. The question is, why should the Thomists then insist that this other argument that they're offering is against the nominalists? Why should they think that that one works when these like very similar Scotist ones don't?
It's almost as though the Thomists following Cajetan here is kind of caught between a rock and a hard place, where no matter which way they go, they're either following closer to the nominalist camp or the Scotistic Univocity camp. Interesting. All
Yeah,
right.
that's right. There's a worry that they're caught between the more realist Scotists and the more anti-realist nominalist Jesuits in the other.
Interesting. Okay. Well, Dominic, this has been a really, really interesting interview. If I could just ask a couple of closing questions, in your personal opinion, if I can get personal here, what do you think that we ought to make of Cajetan's solution and the problem that it poses? I say this question because I myself am rather a big fan of both Cajetan and his theory of analogy. But when I first heard your talk, I kind of was stopped in my tracks a little bit and thinking like, oh my goodness, are Eric Shavara and the radical orthodoxy, are they right all along? You know, as Cajetan given us reason to affirm nominalism, or do you think that at the very least uh it's an unanswered question how Cajetan's solution can be defended alongside realism?
Yeah. So I don't think that Cajetan's position is inconsistent or contradictory or anything.
Right.
So it's a position that you could very well hold. There's nothing. There's no internal inconsistency in it. Siri has an argument about this, and I think he's right about that. And so that's good for the Thomists. On the other hand, they are these Cajetanian Thomists are in a difficult dialectical position, I think. Namely, they can't consistently argue for their theory in a non-question begging way against the nominalists, and that's not a position you want to be in, right?
Right.
You never want to be in a position where like you hand your opponents the very resources they need to reply to your arguments against them.
Right.
That's not ideal. So I think there's a couple things you could do here is well, and I'll talk about it from different perspectives. So the Scotus, right? Scotus is making this point as an argument against Henry and against defenders of analogy. So I think Scotus thinks here's the upshot of this: we should just accept univocity of all of these concepts. And uh, um, that should be the takeaway from this debate. Cajetan is going to say, look, I think the Thomists should say something like, unless they can come up with some response to this dilemma, I think they're still within their rights to say, yeah, that's an unfortunate feature of our theory, but it's still the right theory, and
Okay.
I'm going to hold it. And go ahead, if you have arguments against me, I can reply to them. I have responses. Sure, I can't like uh, attack these Jesuit nominalists the way I want to, but oh well.
Oh well.
That's consistent. Yeah. And on the other hand, the Jesuit nominalists come out looking pretty good all this, and I think that's one of the upshots is nominalism doesn't look so vicious and having these earth-shattering consequences that sometimes it's said to. Really, it's just analogy all the way down. Which is why it's kind of funny. We have these narratives today about how great analogy is and how bad nominalism is. And one of the upshots of this is you can't really consistently run both of these narratives
Right.
because what the Jesuit nominalists are doing is just saying, yeah, nominalism and analogy everywhere, and that's not a bad position. Um, I'll I will say the issue of objective precision is very difficult,
Yeah.
and I think if you do want to hold to objective precision, um, in my own personal view, if you do want to hold to objective precision, then you should probably admit, I think, and again, this is some taste is going to come into this a little bit, but that you're better off abandoning this Cajetan view and going for something like Suarez's or Yavelli's or Scotus's. Um, those are a little more stable, right? I think. On the other hand, if you don't like objective precision and you like formal precision, um, and you agree with a bunch of these arguments, very interesting arguments that the nominalists give that we haven't gone into, that objective precision is impossible. If you agree with those, then one of the upshots of this is like, look, nominalism looks pretty good. Um,
Right.
there is one middle position that I'm going to mention as another option. You could have the view. I don't know anyone who holds this historically, but you could have a view where there is objective precision of species from individuals, but not of genera. So you could
Oh,
have the view where all species terms are univocal, humanity is univocal, and you can do that because if you have like matter as the principle of individuation, say, um, you in that case there is a real distinction between. You could say there's a real distinction between the particularity and the particularity of humanity and humanity, because the matter is really distinct from it. Um, in which case, uh, you could hold that our species terms are univocal, but none of our genus terms are. And this would be
okay.
sort of a middle ground if you wanted, where you say, what's real? Species. There are universals, um, there are common natures, but they're only species. Genera, no, those are all nominalistic. Um, so that is a middle ground you could go. As I say, I don't know anyone who holds it. I would like to find someone who does. Maybe there are problems with it, because I'd like to think more about it. But it's not a bad view. Uh,
Right.
strikes me.
Interesting. All right. Well, maybe as a closing question, I always try to end my episodes with this kind of question. Do you have any resources or books for those who'd want to learn more? I know this is kind of a difficult question because we're kind of dealing with uncharted territory post Cajetan, but do you have any sort of resources that you would go to in studying these issues?
Yeah, I mean, I would certainly plug Dominic Torre's book, which we've mentioned, as it's a really great book if you want to learn about this issue in particular up through Uvelli or so. Um, in terms of other people and scholars to look at, not necessarily books or not necessarily just on analogy and univocity, but this period of scholasticism in general. Um, Lukáš Novak has some great stuff. Klaus Anderson, Daniel Novotny, Daniel Hyder. There's a bunch of people who are doing some really interesting work on 17th century scholasticism, and their papers and books are worth looking at.
Okay, perfect. Well, Dominic, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.